Did you know 1999 stands as the most brutal year for executions in the United States since 1976? In a single year, dozens of men and women were led down the final corridor, each carrying their own story of violence, remorse, and, for many, denial. But what really happens in the last hours before the state carries out its sentence? In this video, we're walking cell by cell through the faces, crimes, last meals, and final words of every person executed in the United States in 1999. As you listen, ask yourself, can justice ever be served by death, or do these stories only add to the legacy of tragedy? Let's begin. John Glenn Moody. On January 5, 1999, John Glenn Moody was executed by lethal injection in Taylor County, Texas. Moody, a 46-year-old white male, had been convicted for the brutal murder of a white female during a violent burglary, a crime that sent shockwaves through the community. In his final hours, Moody was subdued, spending time in quiet reflection on his past and the choices that led him to death row. For his last meal, he requested a cheeseburger, French fries, and a Dr. Pepper, simple comfort food for his final night. As the execution chamber filled, the warden asked if he had any last words. Moody offered a brief but heartfelt apology to the victim's family, expressing hope that his death might bring them some measure of closure. Moments later, the drugs took effect, and Moody was pronounced dead, marking another somber chapter in Texas's history of capital punishment. John Walter Castro. Just 2 days later, on January 7, 1999, Oklahoma carried out the execution of John Walter Castro, Sr., a 37-year-old American Indian. Castro had been convicted of the brutal murder of a white woman, a crime that left a deep scar on the local community. As his execution date approached, Castro did not request a special last meal, opting instead for the standard prison fare offered that day. In his final moments, Castro addressed the witnesses with a quiet, somber tone, asking for forgiveness and expressing genuine regret for his actions. The process moved forward without disruption, and the lethal injection was administered as scheduled. While Castro's case drew little national media attention, the pain and loss endured by the victim's family, as well as the ripple effects on all those involved, lingered long after. His execution was seen by some as a necessary closure, but for many the wounds remained raw. Ronnie Lee Howard. On January 8, 1999, Ronnie Lee Howard was executed for the 1991 killing of Trooper Michael Rao, a tragedy that unfolded during a routine traffic stop on I-95. Stopped for a minor infraction, Howard responded with sudden violence, firing multiple shots and ending Rao's life at the roadside. The murder of Trooper Rao sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the local community, where he was remembered as a dedicated officer and loving family man. Howard was swiftly captured and convicted of murder, spending years on death row as appeals ran their course. On the day of his execution at Broad River Correctional Institution, Howard requested fried fish, hush puppies, and coleslaw for his last meal. Facing his final moments, Howard addressed Rao's family, offering a quiet apology. "I'm truly sorry for your pain." In the end, lethal injection brought his life to a close. While the state viewed Howard's execution as justice, for many, Trooper Rao's absence remained an unhealed wound, a reminder of the dangers faced by those in uniform. Dobie Gillis Williams. Dobie Gillis Williams was executed for the 1984 murder of Sonia Nippers, a 26-year-old woman who was attacked and killed in her home in Many, Louisiana. The crime, carried out late at night, shocked the close-knit community, leaving residents shaken and grieving. Williams was convicted largely on circumstantial evidence, and throughout his 15 years on death row, he consistently proclaimed his innocence. His case drew attention from advocates and critics of the death penalty, many of whom raised concerns about the investigation and the fairness of his trial. On his final day, Williams requested a cheeseburger, French fries, and a strawberry milkshake, his last small comfort. As he lay on the gurney, facing lethal injection, Williams used his final words to maintain his innocence. "I did not kill her." At 12:01 a.m. on January 8, 1999, the sentence was carried out. Though the state closed the case, the debate over Williams' guilt and the justice of his execution still echoes in discussions about capital punishment. Kelvin Malone. On January 13, 1999, Missouri's death chamber filled with quiet tension as Kelvin Shelby Malone, a 37-year-old black man, faced the end of his life. Malone was convicted of a brutal robbery and murder that left a white man dead in St. Louis County, a case that shook the city. During his years behind bars, Malone became notorious for his stone-cold demeanor and refusal to show remorse. As his final day arrived, Malone requested a hamburger, French fries, and a Coke for his last meal, a starkly simple choice for someone whose final hours were anything but ordinary. Witnesses later recalled how he maintained composure, addressing the victims' families with a rare apology. "I'm sorry for all the pain I caused." Those were among his last words. As the lethal injection began, there was little resistance, only silence and a sense of grim finality as his breath faded. Malone was pronounced dead shortly after, marking another chapter closed in Missouri's death row history. Jesse James Gillies. That same day, January 13, 1999, Arizona carried out the execution of Jesse James Gillies, age 38, for the murder of a white woman in Maricopa County. Gillies' crime had shocked a quiet community and lingered in local memory for years. Known for his rugged upbringing and turbulent past, Gillies maintained a defiant attitude even as his sentence drew near. On his last night, he ordered fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, perhaps seeking some comfort from childhood memories. As he was led into the death chamber, Gillies offered a statement of regret and sorrow for his actions, apologizing directly to the victim's family. The atmosphere was somber as the drugs entered his system and he drifted away quietly, leaving behind the weight of his crime and the pain that rippled through two families. With that, another execution was marked off Arizona's record in what would become a relentless year. Troy Dale Ferris. Troy Dale Ferris was executed for the December 3, 1983, murder of Tarrant County Deputy Sheriff Clark Rosenbaum, Jr. Rosenbaum had interrupted a roadside drug deal involving Ferris, Vance Nation, and Charles Lauder near Saginaw, Texas. As Rosenbaum approached, Ferris pulled out a .357 Magnum and shot the deputy twice. One bullet punctured his protective vest, the other pierced his lungs and heart, killing him instantly. The killing sparked an intense manhunt, ending in Ferris's arrest and subsequent conviction. During his nearly 16 years on death row, his case drew attention due to early appeals highlighting possible trial errors. On the night of his execution, Ferris requested steak, fried shrimp, and a baked potato as his final meal. Before being led to the chamber, he offered a heartfelt final statement aimed at Rosenbaum's family. First off, to the Rosenbaum family, I have nothing but love for you. Clark did not die in vain. Through his death, he led this man to God. I love you. I'm done. At 6:34 p.m., the lethal injection took effect, ending a sentence that had haunted both law enforcement and Ferris himself for nearly 2 decades. Mark Arlo Shepard. Mark Arlo Shepard was executed for the November 28, 1993, double homicide of Richard and Rebecca Rosenbluth in Chesterfield County, Virginia. Shepard, who had been involved in a robbery at the Rosenbluth home, admitted to taking part but insisted he was not the triggerman. Prosecutors argued he was deeply complicit, citing ballistic evidence and his attempt to conceal involvement. After a high-profile trial, Shepard was sentenced to death by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center. Over nearly 6 years on death row, Shepard filed multiple appeals, maintaining his non-shooter claim. Despite the controversy, appeals courts upheld his sentence. For his last meal, Shepard requested a steak with mushrooms, baked potato, and chocolate ice cream. In his final statement, he addressed the Rosenbluth family directly, expressing regret without explicitly claiming innocence. I'm sorry for the pain you have endured. At 9:07 p.m. on January 20th, 1999, the lethal injection was carried out. The Rosenbluth family said they felt a sense of closure, even as lingering questions remained about the full extent of Shepard's role. Joseph Ernest Atkins. Joseph Ernest Atkins was executed for the horrific October 27, 1985, killings of his adoptive father, Benjamin Atkins, and his neighbor, 13-year-old Karen Patterson, in North Charleston. Atkins had been paroled after serving time for a prior murder and returned home that night armed with a shotgun, machete, and revolver. He cut phone lines before entering the Patterson duplex, then shot Karen as she slept. When Benjamin tried to intervene, Atkins shot him as well. The vicious double murder rocked the community and shocked investigators. Convicted of 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of assault, burglary, and weapons charges, Atkins received a death sentence for both killings. He spent more than 13 years on death row at the Broad River Correctional Institution. For his final meal, Atkins requested steak, fries, a tossed salad, corn on the cob, and chocolate pudding. He declined to make a final statement. At around 6 p.m. on January 23, 1999, Atkins was executed by lethal injection, concluding a case marked by brutality, community grief, and long-standing debate over parole decisions. Martin Vega. Martin Vega was executed for the 1984 murder of Manuel Hernandez, a Houston convenience store clerk. Vega entered the store late at night, intent on robbing it. When Hernandez tried to resist, a struggle broke out behind the counter, ending with Vega shooting Hernandez at close range. The killing was captured on the store's security camera, providing clear evidence that quickly led police to Vega's arrest. Hernandez, remembered as a hard-working husband and father, left behind a grieving family who never fully recovered from the senseless loss. Vega's trial was swift, with the jury returning a death sentence after reviewing the overwhelming evidence. On the day of his execution, Vega requested tacos, rice, and beans for his last meal, along with a soft drink. As he lay on the gurney, Vega offered a brief apology to Hernandez's family and thanked his own relatives for standing by him. Lethal injection was administered at the Huntsville unit, marking the end of a long and painful chapter for all those touched by that night's violence. Derek L. Gerlaw. On February 3, 1999, Arizona executed Derek L. Gerlaw, age 38, for the murder of a white male in Maricopa County. Gerloff's crime was particularly violent, and his case drew headlines for years as appeals worked their way through the courts. Known for his quiet manner and almost resigned acceptance of his fate, Gerloff's final meal consisted of 2 cheeseburgers, fries, and a milkshake, familiar flavors from another life. As the final moments approached, he spoke softly, offering an apology to his victim's family. When the drugs took hold, the death chamber fell silent. Another case closed, another life ended, as Arizona's relentless calendar of executions continued through the year. Sean Sellers. Sean Sellers was executed by the state of Oklahoma on February 4, 1999, at age 29. Sellers' case was infamous. He was convicted as a juvenile for killing his mother, stepfather, and a store clerk, becoming the first U.S. prisoner executed for crimes committed as a minor in decades. His appeals, centered on claims of mental illness and remorse, attracted international attention and controversy. For his last meal, Sellers requested pizza, salad, and a soft drink, echoes of childhood in a life that went tragically wrong. Sellers spent his final moments praying for forgiveness, asking for mercy not just for himself, but for all young offenders. The lethal injection was administered as candlelight vigils burned outside, sparking debate that would last far longer than the execution itself. Tony Leslie Fry. That same day, February 4th, 1999, Virginia carried out the execution of Tony Leslie Fry, a 23-year-old white man convicted of murdering another white male in Chesterfield County. Fry's crime shocked those who knew him, and while his case did not draw national headlines, the tragedy weighed heavily on both families involved. For his last meal, Fry chose fried chicken, coleslaw, and iced tea, a classic Southern comfort, perhaps a final link to happier times. In his final moments, Fry spoke softly, offering heartfelt apologies to both his own family and the family of his victim, expressing hope that they might someday find peace and forgiveness. The execution proceeded swiftly and without incident. The drugs took effect as Fry closed his eyes for the last time. His death marked yet another entry in Virginia's long and controversial history with the death penalty, a reminder of the lives altered and lost with each execution. Jahtaroon Siripongs. On February 9, 1999, California executed Jahtaroon Siripongs, a 43-year-old Asian man convicted of killing both an Asian male and an Asian female during a robbery in Orange County. Siripongs' troubled life, marked by poverty, tragedy, and a sense of displacement after immigrating from Thailand, played heavily in the appeals for clemency, appeals that ultimately fell on deaf ears. For his last meal, Siripongs chose rice, fish, and green tea, a simple request that reflected his cultural roots. In his final words, he offered forgiveness to those who had condemned him and spoke with deep remorse for the pain he had inflicted on the victims' families. The death chamber was still as the lethal drugs were administered, and Siripongs passed quietly, leaving behind a case that stirred debate about redemption, justice, and the complex stories often hidden behind the headlines of capital punishment. George Cordova. On February 10, 1999, Texas executed George Cordova, a 39-year-old Latino man found guilty of murdering another Latino male in Bezar County. Cordova's life had been marked by hardship and family turmoil, and his trial and appeals offered little hope of reprieve. For his final meal, he chose tamales, rice, and beans, a simple but meaningful nod to his cultural roots. As his execution approached, Cordova addressed the witnesses with calm acceptance. He spoke plainly, saying he was ready to go home and asked for forgiveness from those he had hurt. The warden gave a slight nod, and the lethal injection was administered, ending Cordova's life within minutes. While his death brought a close to his troubled story, it also became another statistic in 1999's record-setting year of executions, each one extinguishing a life but leaving behind questions about justice, forgiveness, and the cycle of violence. Danny Lee Barber. On February 11, 1999, Danny Lee Barber, a 43-year-old white male, was executed by lethal injection in Dallas County, Texas. Barber's crime was the brutal murder of a white female, an act that left a family forever changed and a community shaken. Over the years of appeals, Barber offered little explanation for his actions, maintaining a quiet and reserved presence on death row. For his final meal, he chose fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and chocolate cake, a classic Southern plate, perhaps echoing the comfort of simpler days. In his last statement, Barber spoke softly, expressing sorrow for the pain he caused and asking for forgiveness from the victim's family. The execution itself was silent and efficient. As the lethal drugs took hold, Barber's breathing slowed, his gaze fixed ahead, and within minutes he was pronounced dead. The sense of closure remained elusive, but for the victim's loved ones, the long wait for justice was finally over. Andrew Cantu, February 16, 1999, marked the execution of Andrew Cantu, a 31-year-old Latino man, at the Texas State Penitentiary in Taylor County. Cantu's crime was a violent triple homicide, taking the lives of a white female and 2 white males during a home invasion. His case stood out for its brutality and the sheer sense of loss it brought to the families involved. On his final day, Cantu ordered a last meal of steak, eggs, hash browns, and coffee, a breakfast fit for a final sunrise. Facing the witnesses, Cantu's final words were brief, apologizing to the victims' families and wishing peace upon them. The lethal injection was administered without incident, and as Cantu drifted away, a hush fell over the chamber. His story closed with little fanfare, leaving behind only the unanswered questions that linger after every execution. Johnny Michael Cox. That same day, Arkansas executed Johnny Michael Cox, a 42-year-old white man convicted of a grisly triple murder in White County. Cox's victims, 2 white females and 1 white male, were found after a home invasion spiraled into chaos. Throughout his time on death row, Cox rarely spoke to the press, his silence deepening the mystery around his motive. For his last meal, Cox requested a cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate shake, clinging to familiar comforts as the hour approached. When asked for final words, Cox looked at the families and said he was sorry for the pain he had caused, expressing regret for a life lost to violence. As the lethal injection took effect, Cox's journey ended quietly, the silence in the chamber a stark contrast to the horrors of his crime. Wilford Berry. On February 19, 1999, Ohio carried out the execution of Wilford Berry, a 36-year-old white man, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. Berry's conviction stemmed from the robbery and murder of a white male, a crime that haunted Cuyahoga County for years. Nicknamed the Volunteer by the media, Berry famously gave up his appeals and asked the state to carry out his sentence, making him Ohio's first execution in over 3 decades. For his last meal, Berry chose a steak, eggs, and hash browns, enjoying every bite. In his final statement, he simply wished his family well and said he hoped his death would bring closure. The process was swift, and Berry died with little resistance, closing a case that reignited debate over capital punishment in Ohio. James Edward Rawdon. On February 24, 1999, Missouri carried out the execution of James Edward Rawdon, a 38-year-old white man convicted of the senseless murder of a white female in Clay County. The crime had been described by prosecutors as random and without motive, leaving the community both stunned and shaken. During his years on death row, Rawdon was known for his withdrawn nature, rarely discussing his crime or showing emotion. When the final day arrived, he requested a meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Simple, comforting food for a man facing his last hours. As Rawdon was led into the execution chamber, he looked toward the victim's family and offered a quiet, sincere apology, admitting the pain he had caused. The drugs were administered, and witnesses watched as his breathing slowed and eventually stopped. Rawdon's execution closed a grim chapter for Missouri, one that left lingering questions about the roots of violence and the finality of justice delivered in the death chamber. Norman Green. That same day, Texas executed Norman Green, a 38-year-old black man found guilty of murdering a white male in Besar County. Green's case became notable not only for the crime itself, but for the lengthy appeals process, during which he consistently maintained his innocence. Despite his claims, the courts ultimately upheld the conviction, and his execution moved forward. On his final night, Green requested barbecue ribs, cornbread, and sweet tea, a last meal reminiscent of home and Southern traditions. In his final moments, he addressed his family, urging them to remain strong and expressing his love. Turning to those affected by the tragedy, Green offered a plea for forgiveness and wished peace to everyone involved, including the victim's family. The chamber fell silent as the drugs were administered, and within minutes, Green's life ended. His execution added another entry to Texas's growing list in a year that set a grim record, each case leaving complex questions and lingering sorrow. Carl LeGrand. On February 24, 1999, Arizona executed Carl LeGrand, a 35-year-old white man and German national, for the murder of a white male during a bank robbery gone wrong in Pima County. The LeGrand case drew international attention after Germany protested the handling of consular rights, but Arizona pressed forward. For his last meal, LeGrand chose double bacon cheeseburgers, French fries, and ice cream. When asked for his final words, he addressed his brother, co-defendant Walter, saying, "Everything is okay." The execution was carried out by lethal injection, with German officials present among the witnesses. The controversy continued long after the curtain fell, making LeGrand's case a landmark in both legal and diplomatic circles. Walter LeGrand. Just a week later, on March 3, 1999, Arizona executed Walter LeGrand, Carl's 37-year-old brother, for the same Pima County murder. Unlike his brother, Walter chose the gas chamber, a rare and agonizing method, over lethal injection. For his last meal, he ordered 6 fried eggs, toast, hash browns, coffee, and juice. In his final moments, Walter's words were for his family, saying he was at peace and hoped they would find comfort. As the cyanide gas filled the chamber, witnesses described Walter's struggle for breath, a stark reminder of the violence embedded in the very act of execution. His case remains one of the most controversial in Arizona history, raising lasting questions about mercy, process, and justice. George A. Quessenberry, Jr. On March 9, 1999, Virginia carried out the execution of George A. Quessenberry, Jr., a 37-year-old man convicted of the fatal shooting of a white male during a robbery in Chesterfield County. The violent crime had shocked the community, leaving a trail of grief and unanswered questions about what led to such a senseless act. As his execution date approached, Quessenberry kept a low profile on death row, speaking little of his crime but reportedly expressing deep remorse. For his final meal, he chose fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, a traditional Southern meal, perhaps a small comfort in his final hours. In his last words, Quessenberry voiced regret and sorrow for the pain he had caused, asking those he had hurt for forgiveness. The lethal injection was administered as witnesses sat in silence, watching as his breathing slowed and eventually stopped. With his passing, Chesterfield County closed a painful chapter, though the echoes of the crime lingered on. Roy Michael Roberts. On March 10, 1999, Missouri executed Roy Michael Roberts, a 46-year-old white male convicted of murdering a white male in Marion County. Roberts' case gained attention for his unwavering claims of innocence, maintaining to the very end that he was not responsible for the crime. Despite his appeals and persistent denials, the courts ruled that the evidence against him was convincing, and the execution moved forward. For his final meal, Roberts requested fried chicken, baked beans, and ice cream, a modest spread for his last hours. As he entered the execution chamber, Roberts again proclaimed his innocence, but also expressed a wish for peace and healing for the victim's family. The lethal injection was administered without incident, and within minutes, Roberts was pronounced dead. For those who followed the case, doubts and unresolved questions remained, but for the justice system, the chapter was officially closed. Andrew Kokorales. On March 17, 1999, Illinois executed Andrew Kokorales, a 35-year-old white man convicted for the brutal murder of a white female in DuPage County. Kokorales' crime was part of a chilling serial killing spree that left the state gripped with fear and outrage. As his execution date arrived, Kokorales chose fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and gravy for his final meal, a small comfort amid a grim reality. In his last words, he expressed deep regret and asked the victim's family for forgiveness, acknowledging the devastation he had caused. The chamber was hushed as the lethal drugs took effect, and Kokorales died within minutes, closing the final chapter on his notorious case. His execution marked not only the end of a life, but also a painful reminder of one of Illinois' darkest and most haunting crime waves, David Lee Fisher. On March 25, 1999, Virginia executed David Lee Fisher, a 57-year-old white man convicted of murdering a white male during a robbery in Bedford County. The crime, a violent escalation of a planned theft, left the community reeling and families on both sides devastated. As his final hours approached, Fisher requested a meal of steak, baked potato, and green beans, a classic choice, perhaps meant to bring a sense of normalcy to his last night. In his final statement, Fisher offered a heartfelt apology to both the victim's family and his own, expressing a sincere hope for healing and peace after so much pain. The execution was carried out quietly and without incident, the witnesses observing as Fisher's life ended in silence. His death became yet another entry in Virginia's record for 1999, a year marked by a steady and unrelenting pace of executions, each one leaving its own legacy of loss. Charles Rector. That same day, Texas executed Charles Rector, a 44-year-old black man convicted of murdering a white female in Travis County. The crime itself was described as senseless, an ordinary encounter that escalated with tragic, irreversible consequences. In his final hours, Rector requested fried chicken, French fries, and a strawberry milkshake for his last meal, a modest comfort on his final night. As he faced the witnesses in the execution chamber, Rector addressed the victim's family directly, expressing deep remorse for his actions and offering a heartfelt apology, asking for forgiveness and peace for all those affected. The lethal injection was administered smoothly, and within minutes, Rector was pronounced dead. His passing added another name to the long list of executions in Texas that year, each case a stark reminder of the violence and loss woven through the state's capital punishment record. James David Rich. On March 26, 1999, North Carolina executed James David Rich, a 26-year-old white man convicted of murdering a white male in Greene County. Known as the Volunteer, Rich had garnered attention for waiving his appeals and actively requesting the state to move forward with his execution, a rare move among death row inmates. For his last meal, Rich chose pizza and a soft drink, keeping his final request simple and unpretentious. In his last moments, he looked at his family and told them he loved them, also expressing a wish for peace for everyone affected by his actions. The execution itself was swift and quiet, the drugs working quickly as witnesses observed in silence. Rich's case became a notable entry in North Carolina's complex history with the death penalty, raising questions about justice, personal agency, and the enduring consequences of violent crime. Robert Excel White. On March 30, 1999, Texas executed Robert Excel White, a 61-year-old white man convicted of murdering a white male during a violent robbery in Collin County. The crime had cast a long shadow over the region, lingering in the collective memory for years, as the case made its way through the courts. For his final meal, White requested chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, and gravy, a meal deeply rooted in Texas tradition, perhaps chosen as a final nod to the place he called home. In his last words, White offered an apology to the victim's family and expressed gratitude to his own family for their unwavering support. The execution was carried out without incident, and as the drugs took effect, White closed his eyes for the last time. Those present were left in silence, reflecting on a story that had spanned decades and served as yet another example of the complex legacy of crime and punishment in Texas, the nation's most active death penalty state. As the first quarter of 1999 came to a close, the echoes of those final words and last meals lingered in the cold corridors of death row. Each case leaves behind a legacy of heartbreak, questions, and uneasy silence, reminders that the year's darkest stories are still unfolding. If these glimpses behind the prison walls left you searching for answers or wanting more, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because some of the most unsettling chapters are still waiting on the other side.